The ruins rose from the sand like the broken teeth of something ancient and enormous, their edges softened by centuries of wind, but their presence still commanding, still threatening in the way only forgotten things can threaten. She stood among them, alone, her boots sinking slightly into sand that had already swallowed civilizations whole, and she watched the shadows move between the pillars where no shadows should have been moving at all. The sun hung directly overhead, a merciless white disk that turned the entire sky into a furnace, and yet the darkness between those weathered stones seemed to slide and shift with a purpose that had nothing to do with light or its absence. She had been walking for 3 days since the supply cache had turned up empty, since the coordinates she'd trusted had led her to nothing but more sand and the mocking silence of a desert that stretched in every direction without mercy or end. Her lips were cracked, bleeding at the corners where the skin had split from dehydration and wind. Her canteen held perhaps 2 mouthfuls of water that tasted like rust and desperation. The wound on her left thigh where she'd caught it on a piece of buried metal 2 nights ago throbbed with every heartbeat, hot and angry beneath the makeshift bandage she'd torn from her shirt. But it was the shadows that held her attention now, those impossible movements in the spaces between stone, and the way they seemed to be watching her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl despite the heat. She had learned long ago that the desert was never truly empty, that beneath its surface lurked things that had adapted to the darkness and the crushing weight of sand, things that had learned to hunt in the spaces where light could not follow. She had seen their marks before, the peculiar patterns they left in the sand, the way certain dunes would shift overnight in ways that wind alone could not explain. But she had never been this close to ruins this extensive, had never felt quite so exposed while standing in what should have been shelter. The structures around her were clearly ancient, their architecture suggesting a civilization that had understood something about the desert that modern travelers had forgotten or never known. The stones were fitted together without mortar, each one precisely shaped to lock with its neighbors, and though time and weather had toppled many of the walls, what remained still formed corridors and chambers that descended into the sand itself, suggesting that what she could see was merely the upper story of something far more substantial buried below. She approached the nearest pillar carefully, her hand resting on the knife sheathed at her belt, though she knew that steel would do little against most of the things that lived beneath the desert's surface. The shadow she'd been watching seemed to retreat as she drew near, sliding deeper into the corridor between 2 partially collapsed walls, and for a moment she wondered if it had been nothing more than her exhausted mind playing tricks, a hallucination born of thirst and pain and the relentless sun. But then she heard it, a sound like stone grinding against stone, coming from somewhere beneath her feet, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was not alone. The temperature seemed to drop as she stepped between the pillars, though the sun still blazed overhead and the air remained thick enough to choke on. The corridor ahead descended at a gentle angle, its floor worn smooth by feet that had walked this path when the world was younger, when these ruins had been a thriving place instead of a tomb. She could see marks on the walls, symbols that had been carved with deliberate care, their meanings lost but their presence still unsettling in the way they seemed to repeat certain patterns over and over, spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at too long, as if they had been designed to disturb rather than communicate. The shadows here were deeper, more substantial, pooling in corners and alcoves where the sun's light could not quite reach, and she was certain now that some of them were moving independently of any light source. She took another step forward, her boots silent on the ancient stone, and that was when she felt the first vibration beneath her feet, a rhythmic pulsing that suggested something massive was moving through the sand far below, something that was aware of her presence and responding to it. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to climb back into the furnace of open desert, rather than venture deeper into these buried passages where the darkness seemed alive with purpose. But the sun would kill her just as surely as whatever lurked below, only more slowly and with greater suffering. Her water was nearly gone, her body was already beginning to shut down from dehydration, and the wound on her leg was getting worse with every hour despite her efforts to keep it clean. She had seen what happened to people who died of thirst in the desert, had found their bodies mummified and twisted in positions of final agony, and she knew that death would not be quick or kind if she simply lay down in the sand to wait for it. So she moved forward, descending into the ruins, trading the certain death above for the uncertain threats below, because that was what survival meant in a place like this. Choosing between terrible options and hoping you lived long enough to regret your choice. The corridor opened into a chamber that must have been magnificent once, its ceiling supported by columns that rose into darkness above, its walls still bearing traces of paint that suggested murals had once covered every surface. Now it was a cavern of shadows and whispers, the air cool enough to raise goosebumps on her sun-scorched skin, the silence broken only by the sound of her own breathing, and that persistent grinding noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She could see other passages leading away from this central space, some blocked by fallen stones, others descending even deeper into the earth, and she realized that these ruins were far more extensive than they appeared from above, that she was standing in what might have been a city that had been slowly devoured by the desert over centuries. The shadows here were so thick they seemed almost tangible, gathering in the corners like living things, and when she turned her head quickly, she could swear she saw them scatter, fleeing from her attention, only to creep back the moment she looked away. Her hand tightened on her knife, though she knew how useless it would be against shadows, against things that lived beneath stone and sand, against whatever was making that sound beneath her feet that was growing louder with each passing moment. She moved to one of the walls, studying the painted fragments that remained, trying to understand what this place had been, what the people who built it had known about the desert that she did not. The images were faded almost beyond recognition, but she could make out shapes that might have been human figures standing before something massive and serpentine, their hands raised in gestures that could have been worship or warning or both. There were other images too, depictions of the desert itself with its endless dunes, but beneath the sand in these ancient paintings were suggestions of spaces and structures, vast hollows where things coiled and waited, and she felt her stomach tighten as she realized what the artist had been trying to communicate across the centuries. The desert was not empty. It had never been empty. Everything that seemed barren and dead on the surface was merely the skin stretched over something far older and more terrible, a network of passages and chambers that extended beneath the entire wasteland, and the ruins above were not structures built on solid ground, but rather the exposed portions of cities that had been pulled down, consumed by whatever dwelled in the depths below. The grinding sound stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise had been, because it suggested awareness, suggested that whatever was making that sound had found what it was looking for. She held perfectly still, barely breathing, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed to have retreated to the far corners of the chamber, as if even they were afraid of what was coming, and she felt the floor beneath her feet begin to tremble with a rhythm that was almost like breathing, almost like the pulse of something enormous stirring from sleep. Dust began to rain down from the ceiling, and she heard stone grinding against stone somewhere above, as if the ruins themselves were beginning to shift, beginning to collapse inward. She had to move, had to make a choice about which passage to take, but every option looked equally dangerous, equally likely to lead her deeper into whatever trap this place had become. Her throat was so dry it hurt to swallow, her vision beginning to blur at the edges from dehydration, and she knew that she was running out of time in more ways than one. She chose the passage that sloped downward, reasoning that if something was coming up from below, she would rather meet it head-on than be caught from behind, and because she could see the faint suggestion of light coming from somewhere deep in that direction, a phosphorescent glow that had no natural source, but which offered the possibility of water, of survival, of something other than death in the darkness. Her descent was rapid, almost reckless, her boots skidding on stone that had become damp somehow despite the desert above, and she realized that she was moving into spaces where water had found its way through cracks and fissures, where the deep aquifers that ran beneath the wasteland had created pockets of moisture that sustained life of a kind. The walls here were slick with condensation, and she could see things growing in the crevices, pale fungi and lichens that had never seen the sun, that had adapted to the eternal darkness and fed on stone and water and whatever else fell into their reach. The phosphorescent glow was coming from these growths, she realized, their light dim but steady, casting everything in shades of green and gray that made the passage feel like the interior of something living, something that had swallowed her whole and was now digesting her at its leisure. The passage opened into a cavern so vast that her light could not find its far walls, a space that might have been natural, or might have been carved by intelligent hands, or might have been both, shaped over eons by water and purpose working in concert. The floor was uneven, broken by pools of water that reflected the phosphorescent glow in patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, and she could hear the sound of water dripping from somewhere high above, each drop striking stone with a clarity that spoke to the absolute silence of this place, the absence of wind or birds, or any sound that belonged to the living world above. She approached the nearest pool carefully, kneeling beside it, and dipping her fingers into water that was cold enough to make her gasp, cold enough to hurt after days under the burning sun. She brought her hand to her lips and tasted, expecting salt or minerals or the bitter tang of contamination. But the water was clean, impossibly clean, as if it had been filtered through miles of stone until nothing remained but purity itself. She drank carefully, knowing that too much too fast would make her sick, and felt the water moving through her body like a benediction, like forgiveness for every mistake that had led her to this place. But even as she drank, she saw them, the shadows moving beneath the water's surface, shapes too large and too fluid to be fish, shapes that moved with intelligence and hunger, and something that might have been curiosity. They circled the pool in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and she realized that the water she was drinking was not empty at all, that these pools were habitats, ecosystems that had evolved in the darkness and now sustained life forms that had no names in any language spoken above. She pulled her hand back slowly, careful not to disturb the surface any more than she already had, and watched as one of the shapes rose toward the light, rising until she could see it clearly, a creature that was all teeth and translucent flesh, its body adapted for a world without light, its eyes reduced to vestigial spots that could sense heat and movement, but not form or color. It hung there just beneath the surface for a long moment, studying her as she studied it, and then it descended back into the depths, disappearing into darkness so complete that even the phosphorescent glow could not penetrate it, and she understood that she was being given a warning, being told that she could drink, but that she should not linger, should not mistake this temporary sanctuary for safety. She filled her canteen, working quickly, trying not to think about what else might be living in this water, what microscopic things might be hitching a ride in her body even now. Survival meant accepting risk, meant choosing the danger you could see over the ones you couldn't, and she had learned long ago that perfect solutions did not exist in places like this. The wound on her leg needed attention too, needed to be cleaned before infection could spread further, and she used some of the cold water to wash away the dried blood and sand, biting back a scream as the liquid found nerve endings that had been exposed by the injury. The bandage she applied was cleaner than the last, torn from the one remaining piece of shirt fabric that wasn't already soaked with sweat and dust, and she tied it tight enough to hurt, knowing that pressure would help control the bleeding if the wound reopened. Her hands were shaking as she worked, whether from exhaustion or fear or the after effects of dehydration she couldn't tell, and when she was finished she sat back against the wall and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, to exist without moving or planning or fighting, even though she knew that every moment of rest was a moment when things could find her, could close in around her in the darkness that pressed against the edges of the phosphorescent glow. The grinding sound returned, closer now, coming from multiple directions at once as if whatever made it had been waiting for her to stop moving, waiting for her to become still enough to locate precisely. She forced herself to her feet, ignoring the protests from muscles that had been pushed beyond their limits, and looked around the cavern for any passage that might lead upward, any route that might take her back toward the surface and the terrible familiar sun, rather than deeper into this underworld where the rules of the surface no longer applied. But all the openings she could see led down or away into darkness, and she realized with a sick certainty that she had descended too far, that the ruins above had been merely the entrance to something much larger, much older, and that she was now in the domain of things that had never left these depths, things that had been here since before humans had learned to walk upright in the light. The shadows were moving again, but these were not the half-glimpsed movements she'd seen above. These were solid, three-dimensional shapes that emerged from passages she hadn't noticed before, shapes that walked on too many legs and carried themselves with the confidence of apex predators in their own territory. She ran without thinking, her body making the decision before her mind could catch up, her boots splashing through shallow water and skidding on wet stone as she sprinted for the largest passage she could see, hoping that size meant it was a main thoroughfare, that it might lead somewhere other than deeper into the warren of tunnels that seemed to extend endlessly beneath the desert. Behind her, she could hear them following, their movements producing sounds that were part scrape and part click, chitinous appendages striking stone in rhythms that suggested communication, suggested coordination, and she knew that she was not being chased by a single creature but by many, by a hunting pack that had learned to work together in the darkness where individual prey could escape, but groups could corner and overwhelm. The passage narrowed, forcing her to turn sideways in places, her shoulders scraping against walls that were no longer worked stone, but raw rock, and she realized that she had left the ruins proper, that she was now in natural caves that predated human presence in the desert by millions of years, caves that had been carved by water during an age when this entire region had been something other than wasteland, when rivers had flowed and life had thrived, and the world had been green instead of gold. The passage opened abruptly, and she stumbled into space, her feet finding nothing but air, and she fell, sliding down a slope of loose scree that might have been an ancient riverbed or might have been the remains of a rock fall. Unable to stop herself, her body tumbling and bouncing until she hit bottom with an impact that drove all the air from her lungs and left her gasping in the darkness. She could still hear them above, their sounds echoing down through the passage she'd just fallen from, but they seemed to be hesitating, seemed unwilling to follow her down this particular route, and she wondered if that was a good sign, or if it meant that she had just plunged into something worse than the hunters who had been chasing her. She forced herself to move, to crawl forward, even though every part of her body was screaming in protest, and her hands found sand, actual sand rather than stone, and she realized that she was in one of the deep places, the spaces beneath the desert where the dunes themselves had collapsed inward over centuries, where the surface and the depths merged in zones that were neither wholly one thing nor the other. A wind began to blow through the darkness, hot and dry, and carrying with it the smell of the desert above, and she followed it because wind meant an opening, meant a route to the surface, even if she had no idea how far she would have to crawl to find it. The passage she was in was barely wide enough for her body, forcing her to worm forward on her belly, her face pressed against sand that got in her mouth and eyes and nose, and she had to fight against panic, against the screaming certainty that she would get stuck, that she would die here in the darkness with tons of sand above her, and whatever hunted in these depths waiting patiently behind. But the wind grew stronger, and she could see light ahead, actual sunlight filtering down through cracks in the stone above, and she pushed forward with renewed desperation, ignoring the pain in her leg and the way her lungs burned from breathing sand-filled air. The passage widened suddenly, and she was able to stand, able to see that she was in a chamber where the desert above had broken through, where sand poured down in constant streams from multiple openings overhead, and she understood that she was directly beneath one of the massive dunes, that the entire structure above was slowly collapsing into the hollow spaces below, that this chamber might exist for another 100 years, or it might collapse in the next 10 minutes, crushing everything within it. She climbed, using the sand streams themselves as pathways, her hands and feet finding purchase where the sand had piled against the walls, and twice she nearly fell when the surface beneath her gave way, when entire sections of the sand slope liquefied and tried to drag her down into the depths she'd just escaped. But the light grew brighter, and she could feel the heat beginning to build, could taste the familiar bitterness of the desert air, and then her hand broke through into open space, into the furnace of afternoon sun, and she pulled herself up and out, collapsing onto a dune that shifted and sighed beneath her weight. The sky above was no longer the clear, brutal blue of morning, but had turned a sickly yellow-gray, and she realized that the wind that had guided her was the leading edge of something much larger, that while she had been beneath the sand, the weather above had been building toward violence. On the horizon she could see it, a wall of darkness that reached from the desert floor to the top of the sky, a sandstorm of the kind that could strip flesh from bone, that could bury entire encampments in minutes, that could reshape the landscape so completely that landmarks disappeared and navigation became impossible. It was still miles away but moving fast, and she knew that she had perhaps an hour before it reached her position, perhaps less if the wind strengthened, and she had no shelter, no equipment, nothing but her exhausted body, and the ruins below that she would rather die than return to. She stood on shaking legs and turned in a slow circle, looking for any feature of the landscape that might offer protection, and that was when she saw it, a different kind of ruin perhaps, a mile to the east, a structure that was clearly artificial, but which looked more recent than the ancient city she'd just escaped. It appeared to be some kind of tower, or perhaps a well, something that rose above the sand rather than being buried by it, and she thought she could see regular openings in its sides that might provide shelter from the storm if she could reach them in time. She started walking, then running, her body finding reserves she hadn't known still existed, driven by the primal terror of being caught in the open when the storm arrived. The sand beneath her feet was already beginning to move in strange ways, responding to winds that preceded the visible wall of darkness, and she could feel the static charge building in the air, could feel her hair beginning to stand on end as the storm's electrical field expanded outward. The wound on her leg had reopened during her climb. She could feel blood soaking through the bandage, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping meant death, and she had not survived everything she'd survived just to die now. Not like this. Not when she was so close to something that might save her. The tower was older than she'd thought, but newer than the ruins she'd escaped. Perhaps a few hundred years old rather than a few thousand, and she recognized the architecture as belonging to one of the various civilizations that had tried and failed to tame this desert, that had built their monuments and their cities and their irrigation systems only to watch them all disappear beneath the sand. This tower had been part of a well system, she realized, designed to reach deep aquifers and bring water to the surface, though the mechanisms that had once done this work were long gone, leaving only the stone shaft itself. She found an opening at ground level and squeezed through it, descending a spiral staircase that wrapped around the central shaft, going down into darkness that was relieved only by the shafts of light that came through ventilation holes cut in the tower's walls at regular intervals. She went as deep as she dared, far enough that the storm's winds couldn't reach her, even if they tore the tower's upper sections apart, and she found a chamber that had once held machinery, now empty except for rust stains and the remains of wooden beams that had rotted away to fragments. She wedged herself into the most protected corner she could find and waited, and moments later, the storm arrived. The sound was like nothing else in nature, a roar composed of millions of individual sand grains striking stone at velocities that turned them into projectiles, combined with a deeper boom of larger rocks being lifted and hurled by winds that could easily exceed 100 miles per hour. The entire tower shook, and she could hear stones being torn from the upper sections, could hear them tumbling down the shaft, or being carried away into the maelstrom outside. The light coming through the ventilation holes became completely obscured, turning the chamber into absolute darkness, and she was grateful for that darkness, because it meant the holes were too small for the sand to penetrate in any quantity, meant that she would not be buried here. Not yet. The storm raged for hours, an assault of sound and violence that seemed to have no end, and she lay in the darkness and tried not to think about the ruins below, about the things that lived in those depths, about the shadows that had moved with purpose, and the creatures that had hunted her through passages where no human was meant to walk. She tried not to think about how alone she was, how far from any help, how unlikely it was that she would ever leave this desert alive. But she was still breathing, still thinking, and that meant she was still surviving, and survival was the only goal that mattered in a place like this. She checked her leg in the darkness, her fingers finding the soaked bandage and the hot, swollen flesh around the wound, and she knew that infection was setting in despite her efforts to keep it clean. She would need antibiotics, real medical attention, none of which were available in the middle of a desert that wanted her dead. But first, she had to survive the storm, and then she had to figure out where the storm had left her, because sandstorms of this magnitude could deposit a person miles from where they'd started, could completely rewrite the landscape so that maps became useless and landmarks disappeared. She had her compass still, assuming it hadn't been damaged, and she had the sun and stars for navigation once the storm cleared. But she had no food except the few emergency rations she'd been saving, and her water situation was better than it had been, but still far from secure. Every decision from this point forward would be critical, every choice a potential death sentence if she guessed wrong, and she felt the weight of that responsibility settling over her like a physical thing. The storm began to abate as the sun was setting, though how she knew the sun was setting from her position deep in the tower she couldn't have said. Some sense of time that had been honed by years in the desert, some awareness of the rhythms of light and dark that persisted even when she couldn't see either. The roar diminished to a howl, then to a moan, and finally to the whisper of wind through stone that was the desert's normal voice, and she waited another hour to be certain, before she began climbing back toward the surface. The spiral staircase was partially blocked now by sand that had poured through the ventilation holes despite their small size, accumulating in drifts that she had to wade through, and when she finally reached the opening she'd entered through, she found it completely buried, sealed by sand that had packed in so tightly it might as well have been concrete. She had to climb higher, searching for another exit, and she found 1-2 levels up where the tower's wall had partially collapsed, creating an opening large enough for her to squeeze through. The desert she emerged into was not the desert she remembered. The entire landscape had been transformed, dunes that had been in one configuration now arranged in another, and the ruins she'd explored that morning were nowhere to be seen, either buried completely or simply in a direction she could no longer identify. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been so ominous. Deep reds and purples that spoke to dust still suspended in the atmosphere, and she knew that there might be more storms coming, that this could be just the first in a series that would make travel impossible for days. She needed to find shelter more permanent than a ruined tower, needed to locate water and food, needed to treat her leg before the infection spread beyond the point where her body could fight it. But as she stood on top of a dune that might have been the same one she'd climbed that morning, or might have been a completely different formation, she had no idea which direction to travel, or what she was even looking for. She chose to descend, to move into the low areas between dunes where water might collect if there was any to collect, where vegetation might grow if anything could grow here, and where travelers before her might have left cairns or markers that would point the way to something resembling civilization. Her leg was agony now, a steady throb that made her nauseous, and she knew she was developing a fever, could feel her body temperature rising as her immune system fought the infection with resources it didn't have to spare. She walked until full darkness fell, until the stars came out in their millions, and the desert temperature dropped from furnace heat to something merely oppressive. And then she walked some more because stopping meant giving in, meant admitting that she might not make it. And she was not ready to admit that. Not yet. The moon rose, nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows, and in its light she saw something that made her stop, made her question whether the fever had already progressed to the point of causing hallucinations. There were structures ahead, dozens of them, emerging from the sand like the ruins she'd explored that morning, but different, more intact, more purposeful in their arrangement, and she realized that the storm had uncovered something, had stripped away the protective layer of sand to reveal what had been hidden beneath. She approached carefully, her hand on her knife even though she could barely grip it with fingers that had gone numb from fever and exhaustion, and as she drew closer, she began to make out details. These were not ancient ruins, but relatively modern structures, perhaps 50 or 60 years old, buildings that had been constructed with concrete and steel, and then abandoned to the desert's mercy. She could see the remains of a water tower, the skeleton of what might have been a generator building, several structures that looked like they had been housing or barracks, and she understood that this had been some kind of research station or military installation, one of the many projects that had been attempted in the deep desert during various wars and resource exploration efforts, all of them ultimately abandoned when the cost of maintaining them exceeded any possible benefit. But abandoned meant empty, and empty meant shelter, and shelter was exactly what she needed. She found a building that was still mostly intact, its roof caved in on one side, but the other still offering protection from the elements, and she pushed through a door that was hanging from one hinge and found herself in what had been a laboratory or workshop, metal tables bolted to the floor still holding equipment that had been deemed too worthless to salvage when the place was evacuated. There were papers scattered across the floor, their text faded beyond reading, and cabinets that hung open revealing nothing but dust and the remains of chemical containers whose contents had long since evaporated or corroded through their vessels. But in the back corner she found what she'd been hoping for, a storage closet that still had shelves, and on those shelves were supplies that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. There were medical supplies, their packaging degraded but their contents still sealed, and she tore open a pack of antibiotics without even checking the expiration date because expired medicine was better than no medicine at all. She found bandages, antiseptic, pain medication that was probably no longer effective, but which she took anyway, swallowing 3 pills dry and hoping they would at least take the edge off. She cleaned the wound on her leg properly for the first time since she'd received it, using water from her canteen and antiseptic that burned like liquid fire, and she watched as infection drained from the cut in colors that shouldn't come from inside a human body. She applied antibiotic ointment that had separated into layers but still smelled vaguely medicinal, and she wrapped the wound with actual medical bandages, layer upon layer until she felt the pressure would be enough to keep everything in place. Then she allowed herself to collapse, to simply lie on the concrete floor of the abandoned building and close her eyes, and she slept despite the danger, despite everything her training told her about staying alert in unknown locations, because her body had reached its limit and would not be denied any longer. Her sleep was deep and dreamless at first, the sleep of absolute exhaustion, but as the night wore on and her fever began to break, dreams began to intrude, strange visions of the ruins below, of the shadows she'd seen moving between pillars, of creatures that waited in the darkness with patience that measured time in centuries rather than hours. She dreamed of the painted murals she'd seen, of the serpentine shapes beneath the sand, and she woke with a start as dawn light began to filter through the holes in the ceiling, convinced for a moment that she was still underground, still being hunted through endless passages where the air tasted of stone and ancient water. But she was not underground. She was in an abandoned research station at least partially above the sand, and she was alive, and the fever that had threatened to kill her had broken during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. She checked her leg and found that while the wound was still angry and swollen, it was no longer getting worse, the antibiotics working their slow magic, fighting back against the infection that had been trying to establish a foothold in her body. She ate one of her remaining ration bars, forcing herself to chew slowly despite the hunger that made her want to inhale the entire thing in seconds, and she sipped water from her canteen, rationing it because she had no idea when she would find more. The station around her might have a well, she realized. These places were always built near water sources, and she spent the morning searching, exploring buildings that were in various states of collapse, until she found what she was looking for, a shaft that descended into darkness with metal rungs set into its sides, still solid after decades of neglect. She climbed down carefully, testing each rung before trusting it with her full weight, and at the bottom she found water, a pool perhaps 20 feet across, fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep aquifers, the same aquifers that fed the underground pools she'd drunk from in the ruins, though this water was accessible without descending into nightmares. She filled her canteen and drank her fill, and for the first time since entering the desert, she felt something like hope, felt that maybe survival was possible after all, that she might actually find her way out of this wasteland alive. She spent that day resting, recovering, letting the antibiotics work, and her body begin to heal, and she used the time to explore the abandoned station more thoroughly, looking for anything that might be useful. She found clothes that were moth-eaten, but still intact enough to supplement her own tattered garments, boots that were too large but which she could make work with extra socks, and in one building she found a map, old and faded but still legible, showing the station's location relative to landmarks that might still exist. According to the map, there was a supply route that had been used to resupply the station when it was operational, a path that followed a series of rocky outcrops and ancient riverbeds, avoiding the worst of the dune fields, and if she could find the beginning of that route, she might be able to follow it to something resembling civilization. She set out the next morning at dawn, her legs still hurting but functional, her body still weak but recovering, and she carried with her everything she'd been able to salvage from the station, including more medical supplies and several days' worth of food that had been stored in sealed containers and which was still edible if not exactly appetizing. The map became her Bible, and she checked it constantly against the landscape, trying to match features on paper to features on the ground, though the desert had changed so much in the decades since the map had been drawn that correlation was difficult at best. But she found the rocky outcrops the map had indicated, found them emerging from the sand like islands in an ocean of gold, and she followed them, climbing when she had to, descending into valleys between formations when the route demanded it, always moving in the direction the map suggested would lead to safety. The days blurred together, each one a struggle against heat and thirst and the constant threat of storms, but each day she covered distance. Each day brought her closer to whatever lay at the end of this journey, and she began to believe that she might actually make it. On the 6th day after leaving the research station, she saw smoke on the horizon, a thin column rising into the sky, and smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, meant someone was alive out here besides herself, and she altered her course to intercept it, moving as fast as her damaged body would allow. As she drew closer, she could make out details. A small encampment of perhaps a dozen tents clustered around a vehicle that looked like it had seen better days, and people moving between the tents, people who looked up as she approached, and who raised hands in gestures that were wary but not hostile. They were salvagers, she learned, people who made their living recovering materials from abandoned sites like the research station she'd found, people who knew the desert as well as anyone could, and who had learned to survive in its harshest regions. They gave her water and food, tended to her wound with supplies better than anything she'd been able to find on her own, and they asked her story in the way desert people did, carefully, giving her space to share or not share as she chose. She told them about the ruins, about the structures she'd found, and the passages beneath, though she left out the details about the shadows and the creatures that had hunted her, because those details made her sound crazy even to herself, and she wasn't entirely certain anymore what had been real and what had been fever dreams born of dehydration and infection. But the salvagers nodded as she described the location, and one of them pulled out a map that was far more detailed than hers, and he pointed to an area marked with symbols she didn't recognize, and said that yes, they knew about those ruins. Everyone who worked the deep desert knew about them, and everyone who worked the deep desert knew to stay away from them, because people who went into those ruins didn't always come back out, and those who did come out were changed, were different in ways that couldn't be easily explained. The desert was old, he told her, older than anyone understood, and there were things living beneath it that had been there since before humans, things that had learned to wait in the darkness, and the ruins were their territory, their hunting grounds, and anyone who ventured into them was taking their life in their hands. She stayed with the salvagers for 3 days, regaining her strength, letting her leg heal properly, and on the 4th day they drove her to the nearest settlement, a small town on the edge of the desert that served as a supply point for people like themselves, people who worked in the wasteland and needed a place to rest and resupply before venturing back out. She bought new clothes there, new boots, proper supplies, and she sat in a small cantina that evening, watching the sun set over the dunes that stretched away to the horizon, and she thought about everything she'd experienced, everything she'd survived. The desert had tried to kill her in every way possible, through heat and thirst and infection and storms and things that hunted in the darkness below, and she had survived all of it through a combination of skill and stubbornness and sheer blind luck. She knew that many people who entered the desert as she had never made it back, that she had been closer to death than she liked to think about, and that survival had not been guaranteed at any point in her journey. But she had survived. She was here. She was drinking cold water in a town that had electricity and running water and all the comforts of civilization, and the desert had not beaten her, not this time. Yet she also knew that the desert never forgot, that it would be waiting for her if she ever returned, waiting with its storms and its heat and its buried things that moved through the darkness with hunger that could never be satisfied. The wound on her leg would leave a scar, she knew, a reminder of this journey, but the real scars were the ones that couldn't be seen, the knowledge of what lay beneath the sand, the memory of shadows that moved with purpose, and the grinding sounds that suggested something massive stirring in the deep places of the world. She finished her water and stood, looking out at the darkening desert one last time before returning to her room, and she knew that despite everything, despite the terror and the pain and the certainty of death that had followed her for days, she would go back eventually, would return to the wasteland because that was who she was, because the desert was in her blood now, and because there were still mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered, still ruins to explore, still stories to learn from civilizations that had fallen to dust. The desert was waiting. It would always be waiting, and when she was ready, she would return to face it again, because survival meant nothing if you spent your life hiding from the things that scared you, and the desert, for all its dangers, for all the ways it tried to kill you, was the most honest place she had ever known, a place where survival was the only currency that mattered and where nothing was hidden. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be, terrible and beautiful and absolutely unforgiving. She would carry those lessons with her wherever she went, the knowledge that survival required constant adaptation, constant vigilance, constant willingness to make hard choices and live with the consequences, and she knew that those lessons would serve her well in whatever came next, whatever other challenges she would face in her life. If you want to hear more stories from the deep desert, tales of survival against impossible odds, and the mysteries that lie beneath the sand, subscribe to Dark Desert Survival. The wasteland holds countless secrets, and every journey into its heart reveals something new about the world and about ourselves. Tell me in the comments, what moment of her journey through the ruins and storms shocked you the most? Was it the shadows moving between the ancient pillars, the creatures hunting in the underground passages, or the moment when the storm transformed the entire landscape and left her stranded? Share your thoughts, and remember that the desert is always waiting for those brave enough or foolish enough to test themselves against its endless challenges.